Now, tonight's event is a really interesting one that I think really captures actually the breadth of interests of people that are members of the Linnean Society. So our speaker tonight is Professor Andrew Gosler, and it's about knowing and naming the roots of ethno-ornithology. Now, Andy is a professor of ethno-ornithology at the University of Oxford, where he is jointly appointed in the Edward Gray Institute of Field Ornithology and the Institute of Human Sciences. And although he is a bird biologist, I think by training, and in fact has carried out an amazing 30+ year long field study of the white-thumb great tit population, he has, and that work has led to a huge amount of understanding of not just that one population, but really large-scale patterns in birds that has been extended to really birds across the world, and identifying some of the really detrimental human activities that are impacting birds and how we can potentially resolve those situations. But really, his work has now moved on to a completely novel or new field, at least, of ethno-ornithology, and thinking about how the reciprocal relationships between humans and nature, specifically birds in this case, are really critical for conservation and also for, I think, human well-being. And while people often think about this sort of field in terms of kind of indigenous cultures, I think a lot of Andy's work is also thinking about how it really relates to grassroots issues, grassroots policy, and really global issues that we, I think, all appreciate we're facing in terms of the biodiversity and environmental crises. So he has a really interesting breadth of research, both in the past and present. He has really taken this into a lot of interesting avenues. And this is reflected in the very long list of affiliations and roles that he's held in different organizations. So I'm going to list a small portion of these right now. He's been a scientific program on the scientific program committee for the International Ornithological Congress and the European Ornithological Union. He is on the Religion and Conservation Biology Working Group for the Society for Conservation Biology. He is on the Oxford University's Network for Peace Studies. He is the vice president of the Oxford Ornithological Society, and he was the president for some 20 years, which, having done this job for about 2 years now, I can't imagine how you manage that, but very impressive. He is also a priest in the Church of England, and he has been awarded many prizes for his work, but some noteworthy ones are the Tucker Medal by the British Trust for Ornithology and the Union Medal by the British Ornithological Union. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Andy up here to talk to us about ethno-ornithology. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you so much, Madam President, for that wonderful introduction. And it's an enormous honor to be with you this evening with so many friends here, present here and online. I know there are many online, so hello. But it's an honor to be in this place close to where Messrs. Darwin and Wallace presented their paper 100 years to the year, not to the day, before I was born. So in kind of honor of that and of the enormous insight that Charles Darwin had and brought to biology and natural history in the 19th century. I'll start with a quote of his from The Descent of Man, where he says, "The formation of different languages and of distinct species, and the proofs that both have been developed through a gradual process, are curiously parallel." And it is that synergy, that parallelism, as it were, between languages and biodiversity that is going to be a major theme of what I want to talk about this evening. Picked up on that a couple of hundred years later, or 150 years later, by the United Nations Environment Programme, recognizing in 2007 that biodiversity also incorporates human cultural diversity, which can be affected by the same drivers has biodiversity and which has impacts on the diversity of genes, other species and ecosystems, the things which biologists will say define what biodiversity is. And so we talk about biocultural diversity increasingly. And what that looks like, we've known for a long time. I'm not sure what the thing is at the top, if it doesn't appear on here. So anyway, it doesn't matter too much. We've known for at least 20 years that there is a correlation spatially between the distribution of languages. About 7,000 human languages are known, not all documented, around the world. A correlation between the distribution of languages and almost any measure of biodiversity. And on this map by Stepp et al. From 20 years ago is plant diversity represented by shades of green and languages represented by a kind of center of gravity as a dot on the map. And you'll see high diversity areas, for example, in the Congo Basin, in the Himalayas, in New Guinea, 1,000 languages in New Guinea, in the Andes, and then up through Central America. So that is saying there is a correlation. I'm shortly going to show you another representation of that correlation, which will be much more striking, an ethno-ornithological depiction of it. So have in mind that, but I want to take us on a little journey first involving honourable gentlemen and look at two different ways of perceiving the world, two different cultural perceptions of the same situation. So we'll go to Tierra del Fuego and the Beagle Channel, and I will tell you shortly who the gentleman at the bottom right is. So you probably recognize Charles Darwin at the top. So 1831, just after Christmas, Charles Darwin sets off as the captain's companion on board HMS Beagle. And in 1859, of course, he coins the term natural selection to contrast with the artificial selection carried out by humans for thousands of years, which was more familiar to many of his readers. Now, we cannot overstate, we must not understate, we cannot overstate the degree to which his own context in time, culture, and class influenced his theory of evolution by natural selection. Every one of us works in a particular cultural context at a particular time. We are here now in this place, influenced by all sorts of things. And that was no different for Charles Darwin. But in those days, it was maybe more natural, or people didn't realize that those influences might be there. And the errors that came out of that cultural construction of a perception of evolution are only now being corrected by a new biology. This stunning graph, though I say so myself, because I plotted it back in November, I don't know how to get rid of that thing at the top. It says that a participant has enabled, there's nothing appearing on there.
Yeah, Gail, I don't see that on here.
No.
It's not showing up on here though, actually.
You move your arrow to where it appears on that screen.
Oh, I see it
That's a
there.
good question.
Didn't see it for a second. Apologies.
Ah,
Oh,
well
what
done.
happened if I?
Yeah,
Nope,
Oh,
that didn't work.
I think if you go up a tiny bit, you'll be there. You were so close.
I think it's just moving
no,
forward.
it's just going forward. Oh, well.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have to make do.
Husband, sorry, do you know how to do this?
Yeah. A participant has enabled something. isn't it?
Now this is going to mess up my whole,
Is it?
yeah. Okay.
Never work with animals, children, or technology. Well done. Well done. We're still sharing. That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
problem is on Zoom.
So we can carry on? Yeah, good. Thank you. So this graph I plotted back in November, and it's another representation of the relationships between biodiversity, in this case, bird diversity, and linguistic diversity. So the horizontal axis, the x-axis, if you prefer, is the number of bird species scaled by area of country. Each point is a different country, 250 countries on there. So number of bird species per square kilometre, log 10, and then and those data are taken straight from BirdLife International's data zone, country by country. Took me a week. Anyway, the vertical y-axis is the number of established languages, similarly scaled, per square kilometre, also log 10, from Ethnologue, to me, courtesy of Wikipedia, who let me just take a table and paste it straight into Excel. What you're looking at here is not a causal relationship. So countries with more bird species have more languages, more indigenous languages. That's what's meant by established languages. It's the number of indigenous languages. What we're looking at here is basically allopatric speciation. It is the effect of local adaptation, whether cultural or biological, genetic, local adaptation and relative isolation from other areas. This is the main way in which evolution happens. It's allopatric, so it's local adaptation, and all of those languages are reflecting local cultural adaptation to a particular place. And I'm going to put some flesh on those bones. But first, I want to, going back to Tierra del Fuego, I want to talk a little about Darwin's perception of the people, because he wrote about it so much, both in The Origin of Species and in The Descent of Man. So he first encountered the Fuegians, the indigenous people of Tierra del Fuego, actually in Tierra del Fuego, as opposed to on the ship, in December 1832, so a year after he left the UK. And they made a very strong impression on him. He refers to them 7 times in The Origin of Species, and in The Descent of Man, he cites the Fuegians as evidence that man is descended from a hairy-tailed quadruped and that we are descended from barbarians. He always refers to these people as savages or barbarians. In The Origin, he states, we see the value set on animals, even by the barbarians of Tierra del Fuego, by their killing and devouring their old women in times of dearth, as of less value than their dogs. And of their language, he says, in The Voyage of the Beagle, his own journal, he says, the language of these people, according to our notions, scarcely deserves to be called articulate. Captain Cook has compared it to a man clearing his throat, but certainly no European ever cleared his throat with so many hoarse, guttural, and clicking sounds. Now I want to introduce the Reverend Thomas Bridges, who was an Anglican missionary working with those people 30 years later. And Bridges documented their language in exquisite detail for 30 years. The dictionary that he published, and I'm going to show you some extracts from it, sorry, that he didn't publish. The dictionary was published by his children in about 1935. They had lived with the Fuegians, they'd grown up with them, and so they knew the culture intimately. Bridges developed his own phonetic alphabet to document their language. I don't know that he was a trained linguist, but this is remarkable, absolutely remarkable work by any stretch of the imagination. I want to show you what this book looks like. 650 pages on Bible paper, naturally. And this is an example of the text. Now, what does he say? And let's see some examples of the words. He says, these natives, the Yagans, have always been misunderstood and made out worse than they are. And I picked out a couple of sentences from this extract just to counterpoint what Charles Darwin had said about cannibalism. He says cannibalism is utterly impossible amongst these Aborigines by the laws of their society of living, in which human life is considered sacred. The lives of the old men, which according to Darwin, I think he said women, but anyway, were those fixed upon for the purpose of cannibalism, are as sacred to them as of any other person, for they are protected by their relatives. Some details about this book, and we can actually now get it as a PDF online, which means we can explore it and search for words, and that's what I've done here. So when it was published, Bridges had thought, he'd estimated that the dictionary contained 23,000 head words. And on publication, his children discovered that, no, it actually contained 32,000, which, this is an unwritten language, okay? This is an unwritten language. But 32,000 words puts it somewhere between Middle Dutch and Classical Latin. This is a serious and complex language with a complex grammar. For example, there are hundreds of words with variants depending on compass orientation. There are thousands of ethno-ecological references, 941 references to canoes, and I think I have one to show you shortly, 317 to trees, 161 of mussels, etc., etc., etc. Sadly, only 29 references to penguins, but maybe that's enough. 28 to shags. There's various other bird references, and I haven't been through them all. But you'll see thousands of references here. An example of how a reference to some natural object or thing can be linked to its utility, and in this case, canoes. So here's a word for certain pieces of young, smooth bark fitted over the rail of canoes in such parts as where the arms rest in paddling to guard them from chafing. I just love that. It's a word for a particular kind of tree bark that you put just on the rails of the canoe so you don't scuff your elbows when you're paddling. That's the detail, the specificity that exists in this language. Ethno-ecological references such as this is basically a habitat description, a kind of countryside. There are numerous examples like this. Couldn't resist a couple of penguin references. So the top one, to leap out of the water when going rapidly through it, the water, as seals, penguins, and otters do, but also, in a variant of it, to get up and rake out shellfish or other small objects from the fire, as if you're flicking them out of the fire. It's sort of reminiscent of the action of a penguin when it's leaping through the water to go faster. And then this word at the bottom, the state of lean and sick penguins which come ashore and stand all drawn up together, and the state of a lazy, indolent person. Just love the image of these penguins have come ashore and they're hungry and tired and they're just sort of standing there looking miserable. And there's a word for that. Well, naturally enough, Darwin's perception of the indigenous people prevailed, and of evolution, because the book was published and nobody knew about Bridges' work. And that language is now extinct. The last native Yagan speaker, Cristina Calderon, and a couple of us, at least in this room, had the privilege of meeting her in the last 10 years, passed away on the 16th of February 2022, age 93, well, estimated 93, celebrated ethnographer, craftswoman, writer, and cultural activist. And poignantly, she died of COVID. Now, these things have consequences. So I'm going to show you another graph. Same data sets as before, but in this case, so bird data from BirdLife, languages from Ethnologue, but here, by countries, the number of extinctions, bird extinctions, scaled again per square kilometre, and the number of immigrant languages per square kilometre. This correlation basically represents the smoking gun of 19th century imperialism. And we know this is important for biodiversity conservation. This is a relatively recent paper, I think it's 2019, Schuster et al. And I pick out a sentence there from the abstract. And this is this is one of thousands of studies like this now. So this is the norm that we find that where does biodiversity persist on this planet? Increasingly, it's in areas managed by indigenous people. So they say this is comparing Australia, Brazil, and Canada. We found the indigenous managed lands were slightly more vertebrate rich than existing protected areas in all three countries. And in Brazil and Canada, that they supported more threatened vertebrate species than existing protected areas or randomly selected non-protected areas. That these things are entering the public consciousness is demonstrated rather nicely by two articles from the Guardian newspaper. I'm sure there's equivalent things in the Telegraph. But the first on the left here, published in January last year, is about the extinction of languages and the significance of that. And the other, just published in December, just past, is on extinctions, 8 bird extinctions from Hawaii. Now, we've known that this was going to happen for at least 20 years because of climate change and the arrival of mosquitoes carrying avian malaria. So this was predicted in a paper in 2002, but these species have now been declared extinct. So that kind of brings me into the area of ethnobiology, and I want to bring it home. I want to bring this home to the UK, because when I got involved in ethno-ornithology and the thought that I'm going to have to spend 20 years of my life, I don't have 20 years to go and work with indigenous people somewhere, but there are kind of indigenous people here, and I want to know about what's going on here. And that's what I'm going to explore with you, to show that not only can we do ethnobiology here, but the processes that are being described on a global stage are also going on here. So ethnobiology can be defined as the study of how people engage with nature, practically, culturally, spiritually, both now and in the past. We can do historical ethnobiology. Understanding these things is the key to effective nature conservation. And the ways in which people think about plants and animals are reflected in the names they give them. And we'll think more about the conservation significance of this later on. So on my screen, I've got a nice picture of a nightingale in the background, which is barely visible on there, but never mind. 3 key issues of conservation significance, and I hope you can hear it. Conservation significance from ethnobiology generally and ethno-ornithology in particular. So the global loss of biocultural diversity that we've just been talking about. Also something increasingly discussed by conservation biologists of the shifting baseline syndrome. The fact that each successive generation has less contact with nature, less opportunity to connect with nature, and so less knowledge about it. And that is the shifting baseline. Everyone remembers how it was when they were a kid. I remember, so I grew up in West London in the 60s, and our garden, which was a small suburban garden, was full of butterflies. None of our students know any butterflies, so they don't see them. So that's the shifting baseline. And then related to that, the growing human disconnection from nature, resulting largely, well, partly from increasing urbanization, not entirely that. There are cultural things as well, the connection with the internet, for example. So I was playing a Nightingale song, and just want to show you some examples of folk names. The main thing that I've been working on, my own sort of research, as opposed to my students' research, is on the English folk names of birds, of which we know more than 7,000. So 7,000 is an important number in this. 7,000 English folk names, 7,000 languages in the world. Nightingale only has 2 or 3 languages, names in English. Maybe because it was so iconic, but I'm going to use that word later to suggest maybe not. Shakespeare knew it as the nightingale, but also referred to it as the philomel. In German, many more names. Of course, the name Nightingale comes from German through an Anglo-Saxon root, so the night singer, obviously. More names, but not thousands. But we go into French, and we do have thousands. And it even starts with a French proverb that mentions it. So if you have a proverb, that might suggest it's pretty iconic, and yet every village has its own name. So there are cultural differences in the number of names. But in English, we have very few. So I've talked about a couple of my heroes. Here's another of my heroes. In fact, where I grew up, one of my early birdwatching places was Perivale Wood in West London, owned by the Selborne Society that greatly honoured Gilbert White. So I learned about him at an early age. And one of the things I learned was that he was the person who discovered the 3 leaf warblers, chiffchaff, willow warbler, and wood warbler. As far as science was concerned, he was the person who first described them. And here's a description or part of it, a reference to it in a letter to Thomas Pennant in 1768. He says, I make no doubt, but there are 3 species of the willow wrens. 2 I know perfectly, and I'm sure that's the chiffchaff and willow warbler, but have not been able yet to procure the 3rd. No 2 birds can differ more in their notes. So he was aware that they differed in their songs, and here they are. And I have no doubt that this was his discovery. He did not, there's no evidence that he obtained information about these birds from his parishioners. However, when we look at the folk names, of folk names suggests that actually country folk knew very well that there were 3 species. So here's folk name for the chiffchaff, and put the song up for a second and play the call. This is the sweet billy note, the sweet. So this is an onomatopoeic call as much as the name chiffchaff is an onomatopoeic name for the song. For the willow warbler, it's such an important part of the countryside, the sound of the countryside. is very widely named. And you might notice these names with Sally there, which I'll talk a little about later. Sally Picker, Sally Pecker, Sally Wren. Sally is a reference to willow. We also see that same Nottinghamshire name, Sweet Billy, because the willow warbler also has a sweet call. Very similar, subtly different when you get your ear in. And then the third species, the wood warbler. And I love this name, Shaking Pettychaps, because this bird literally quivers when it sings, when it produces that song. So whoever named that bird, whoever coined that name, was watching it as well. Probably he, was very familiar with this bird and was able to watch it. But I think this other name, tweet, I think is also onomatopoeic. As for me, it's reminiscent of the call. So we have kind of two parallel cultures going on. There's a new scientific culture, 18th century, 19th century, that's doing its own thing, completely oblivious, well, maybe not for Gilbert White, but pretty much oblivious that a lot of this stuff is known by the country folk. Okay, here's another example. I love this. The grasshopper lark began his frivolous note in my fields last Saturday. Had I not been a little acquainted with the insects and known that the grasshopper kind is not yet hatched, I should have hardly believed, but that it had been only a sister whispering to the caterpillar, warbler, whispering in the bushes. The country folk laugh when you tell them that it's the note of a bird. And I kind of wonder, because when we look at all the folk names for it, it seems pretty clear that they knew it was a bird. And I just wonder if it was slightly ironic laughter. Yes, Vicar, we know that. Thank you very much. Yeah. You must think we're daft. Anyway, I want to talk about a few, leave Gilbert White aside, as a wonderful man, and talk a bit more about some of these folk names and then where they've come from and some background. And I'm going to talk about names for three of these warblers. So the ones that occur just about still in the British Isles. So the reed warbler and sedge warbler still common. The marsh warbler much rarer now. And I'm going to play you some songs. So this is the reed warbler. Is this coming through? And if you listen carefully, you'll hear, and if you know your birdsong, of course, you'll pick up some mimicry, because this species mimics a little bit. Unlike this species, the sedge warbler. So reed warblers, basically, when you're listening to a reed bed, there's something out there going plink, plink, plonk, plonk, what, right? That's a reed warbler. But then the thing with the scratchy song, possibly in the reed bed, but more likely on the edge, is this. That was mimicry, that's it. So there's yellow wagtail in there. Later on in this recording, there's linnet. So that's the sedge warbler, and that mimics more. That was mimicry, wasn't it? Was that swallow? Something like that, I think. But this, the much rarer in this country now, marsh warbler, is a mimic bar none. In fact, almost all of its song is mimicry. It's difficult to know. So in an important study of marsh warblers in Belgium some years ago, it was counted that one male marsh warbler was singing the songs of something like 120 different species, and the population as a whole singing the songs of 160 species. And before ornithologists really knew from ringing data where marsh warblers wintered in East Africa, it was estimated from some songs of East African birds that marsh warblers were singing in Belgium when they came in. Now, do ask me at the end why they do this, because I have my own theory and I would love to put it out there tonight. Another thing about the marsh warbler is that unlike the other two, it sings at night. So if we look at the folk names, there's some very interesting things going on here. Fisherman's nightingale, it's got to be talking about a marsh warbler. And where some of those names have come from, you think, wow, was there actually marsh warbler in Cumbria in the 19th century? But I think the more exciting ones are these references to mockingbird. The mockbird, the mockingbird from Somerset, and Cumbria again. English mockingbird. Mockingbird means it's mimicking. So whoever coined, so the original mockingbird was not that American thing, but a marsh warbler in an English marsh, a British marsh. And whoever coined that name was sitting there at night, probably fishing, and therefore probably male, and thinking, oh, he's singing a swallow now. Oh, that's a blue tit. That's a linnet. In other words, whoever coined that name knew his bird songs. Right? So we can get all the way from a folk name for a warbler to knowing something about the knowledge of people in the past. Now, where do all these wonderful names come from? And the person who collated them, because most of them were published, the person who collated them was this wonderful man, Michel Defay, who I met 10 years ago at his home. And that amazing book, that huge tome on his lap, is volume 1 of the 2-volume work on the thesaurus of bird names. He documented, or rather collated 100,000 folk names, European folk names of birds, 100,000 for what, 600 species? 7,000 English folk names for 150 species, 100,000 folk names in 11 European languages. And that's the primary source. And his history of how he came to be so enthralled by this would be a lecture in itself. Is wonderful. But he lists about, as I say, 7,000 English folk names. And I mentioned that most quarry species, and what we mean by that is not birds that live in quarries, but birds which are shot, birds that have been treated as quarry, such as wildfowl. Most quarry species were non-passerines. And I want to show you some of the passerine names to give an idea of the richness of this. So where these names came from, during the 19th century in particular, the Zoologist journal, magazine, they made the mistake in about 1832, I think it was, of the editor saying, because people wanted to know what did the British list of birds look like? What species were actually here? So they put it out in the Zoologist, and they got all these different names. I thought, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. What is a poly dishwasher? Well, it's a pied wagtail. But the point is that once they realized that there were all these regional differences, they needed to know what they look like. And so I say they made the mistake, well, to our benefit, of inviting people to write to the editor and send in these names. And this is just one example from 1878. So this went on for decades. And shortly after this, the editor got a bit fed up and said, "Oh, well, actually, there's an anthropological or heritage journal that's starting up, and you could send them there, because I think we've maybe had enough." But this is an example of one G.G. Little, who wrote to the editor with a list of names. And I picked on this one in particular, so I've been able to go back to some of these original sources, which Michel Defay listed in his book, and picked out one really interesting little reference, because sometimes the letters included a little bit of sort of cultural anthropological background. And he says, "By the way, has it struck any philologist, so linguist, that names of animals, particularly of birds, whose names are under the protection of the rising and bird nesting generation, basically small boys, are more likely to be handed down correctly than perhaps any other words? Is not this worth the attention of the Anthropological Society?" And here we are 150 years later, and I want to tell Mr. Little that, yeah, I think it is, actually. I think it's really, really interesting. And the reason for that, in the 1870s, you will know that every Victorian middle-class drawing room had a cabinet of birds' eggs. They are scientifically worthless. Some of them are misidentified for sure, but there is no documentation saying where they've come from, when they were collected. It is just a clutch of eggs with a label, usually handwritten in pencil, saying blue tit. So scientifically, they're pretty much worthless. But the cultural significance is that those small boys in the countryside were collecting eggs to sell. They'd maybe get a penny for a clutch of yellowhammer, to sell to dealers to make up these collections. So there was a whole industry, a whole culture of egg collecting. And these kids were fantastic ornithologists. And they coined their own names for the birds. And they passed those names on. So this was an oral tradition, basically, that was passed on within a particular age bracket, which has maybe contributed to the perception that natural history was something that kids did. You might like to sort of reflect on that in the current political situation. I just want to show you some of these names reflecting references to nests and eggs. So there's some gorgeous names. I love the bum barrel, but that just says more about me than them. For the long-tailed tit, those are particularly nest references for the long-tailed tit. And then there are these cuckoo references in the names of some other species. So meadowpipit and tree pipit, it's absolutely explicit. Cuckoo's made. They are both commonly cuckoo hosts. I believe that the foolish sparrow name, Scottish name for the dunnock, is also a cuckoo reference, because the dunnock egg is plain blue, and dunnocks are totally undiscriminating, so they'll not notice a cuckoo egg. Dunnock cuckoos have not evolved to match their eggs to dunnock eggs because they haven't had to, in the way that they have had to with reed warblers and meadowpipits. And then some lovely names for bunting eggs, and there's a picture of it doesn't matter whether yellowhammer or corn bunting, they're very, very similar, but these references to scribbling finch, writing linnet, the scribble lark, scribbling schoolmaster is wonderful. So you get a sense that here's somebody who spends part of their life in school, at the pointy end, and these eggs look like they've been scribbled on. I think that the significance of children in these things are quite important. So, just to characterize the folk names, they're phonetic and they're contextual. So they relate to the context in which you will see or experience that bird, whether it's onomatopoeic, whether it's sound or sight or the habitat or whatever. It's contextual and it's phonetic. It's what you experience. It is not attempting to put a bird into a particular, let's say, evolutionary framework, which is what, here we are in the Linnean Society, what scientific naming is trying to do. The names are very often referential, referring to making a reference for a less familiar species to a more familiar species, which the coiner is reminded of. And that can give an apparently systematic structure. So, for example, everyone will know the ring ouzel. Ouzel is a blackbird. Water ouzel here is a dipper. So the referent ouzel is your, in fact, water ouzel is basically something that looks like a blackbird that's in the river. And the ouzel, probably from Amsel, an Anglo-Saxon root for blackbird. Those reference species are defined as iconic. And that's a specific technical term in semiotics, which means it's non-arbitrary and reminiscent of something, as opposed to a symbolic or indexical name. Iconic species, so those ones that with which you're more familiar, which you refer something else to. Furze robin would be another example for the stonechat. Furze being gorse, so a robin that you see in the gorse. And furze wren would be Dartford warbler. It is a Dartford warbler. So iconic species tend to have more names. So 164 for the wren, and fewer references to other species. So their own names, those 164 names, will not be referring to another species. They are the iconic reference, and they tend to appear in a systematic structure because of that. It's a something wren, for example. So wren appears to be sort of generic. Another thing about the English folk names in particular is this combination. So everyone knows Jenny Wren, but it's combination with a first name or a Christian name. Hedge Betty for the Dunnock. There you've got Polly Dishwasher. And a few there, Kitty Longtail, Longtail Tit. And we think what's happening here, they may be coined by children, or they may be coined by their parents for the children. The point is that these are names to teach the local birds to your kids. And how does that work? Because in a culture which was known well to gentlemen here, a culture in which you would not refer to anyone by their first name unless they were a child or a very close friend and a member of the family, this is implying that these creatures are members of your family or their children, and either way, we need to look after them. We need to care about them. And this is about teaching the local birds to the children. And something that supports that is an analysis of, this is just the passerine names that I've worked on, about 3,500 passerine names. And on the x-axis is the number of those, I call them familiar or friendly names, because sometimes they're not just sort of Jenny Dishwasher or whatever, Jenny Wren, but something else that is quite sort of humorous. And on the x-axis is the number of monolexic folk names. Now that means the name is reduced to a single word. So something you're very familiar with, you'll just call it a robin or a swallow. you won't call it a European robin or a barn swallow, because there is only one swallow in this country. We don't have to call it a barn swallow because there aren't any other sorts. So you get that reduction to a single word. And what's happened with robin was in the 19th century, it was more widely known as the redbreast. And then it became the robin redbreast. So by this sort of cultural transition, and then they just dropped the redbreast, and that was to do with the post office. Maybe less said about them at the moment, the better. Because early postmen were known as robins because they wore a red thing, and that actually got fixed as its name. So it started as an alliterative Christian name, basically, for the redbreast. Now, what you've got here is a highly significant correlation. No individual name can be on both of those axes. You cannot have a name of the form Jenny Wren that is also monolexic, which means it has one name. So what it's saying is that those species with those kinds of with some or more of those names of the Jenny Wren form are also more likely to have more other names of a monolexic form. And what you find, and that's what the different symbols represent, is that the open circles are more often, significantly more often, iconic references. So they're familiar and they are used as the references for other less familiar species. And that gives the appearance, can give the appearance, as I say, of a systematic structure. I'm going to race through this a little bit, but just a few other points about the names that very often have multiple meanings. So Bessie Brantel, these Bessie names, particularly for species related to water, and Michel Defay suggests that it may be from a Norman French connection for a stream. Sally Wren, Sally is obviously a girl's name, like we've just been talking about, but it's also a willow reference, and it's also a behavior, sallying, flying out, catching a little fly and flying back, which willow warblers and chiffchaffs do. So the Sally Wren, what a wonderful name, is saying, and wren is just a reference to a small bird. So this is saying, this is a small bird that lives in willows. You should regard it as part of your familiar family, and that's its behavior. And kind of one of my favorites, I couldn't resist. The cold arse bird is an Essex name for the fieldfare, which arrives, has a frosty grey rump and arrives very often on a cold east wind. Well, as I say, Michel Defay found 7,000, collated 7,000 English folk names, and the number of names vary hugely. For the non-passerines, the smallest number of names is the collar dove. Well, that's not surprising. There are no folk names for the collar dove because it only arrived here in the 1950s. But 180 names for the grey heron, the nightingale. For the passerines, only 2, as we mentioned, and 164 for the wren. And that variation actually is predicted by the relative abundance, the relative salience of birds, the likelihood that you will meet that species. I could show you a lot more detailed data that were in this paper that I published in the Journal of Ethnobiology, but this kind of characterizes it, looking at the number of counties where that species occurred in the 19th century, which we know from the Historical Bird Atlas, which went through the Victorian county histories, and then just the number of folk names, and you can see pretty good, strong correlation. And the one outlier there is the green woodpecker, which has some significant and slightly unpleasant cultural connections. So getting near the end, to go back to thinking about the conservation significance of all this, because, you know, we could say, oh, well, that's nice, Andy, but so what? So the bird names reflect a rich culture engaged with birds, showing intimate knowledge of bird behavior and ecology and relative abundance. And this provides, you remember the second point that I made earlier on about the shifting baseline. This provides a new kind of baseline by which to assess the lost awareness of nature in contemporary British culture, and not just British culture. It's a global phenomenon, the loss of connection and knowledge of nature. So to go back to those 3 points, shifting baseline syndrome and the growing disconnection from nature, I want to end up by talking about that disconnection. Because I've done some research on that. This book by Richard Louv, which coined the term nature deficit disorder, was really a monumental publication, actually, nearly 20 years ago, which pointed to what then later has been described as the extinction of experience. And I want to show you some data about what that looks like. So for quite some years, I've taught on the biology field course at Oxford. Here's some undergraduates all facing away from you, so all totally anonymous. And there are numerous studies. When I say numerous, it's now hundreds and hundreds of studies around the world documenting a decline in natural history knowledge between generations, of people saying, well, the kids now don't know what we knew or our grandparents. Many millennials know barely a handful of common plant or animal species, but there have actually been very few quantitative studies documenting that decline in post-industrial societies. And that's what I set out to do in 2013 for a couple of years with the biology field course. And then it was published a couple of years ago with Steve Tilling from the Field Studies Council. So we studied the natural history knowledge of 149 British born, because we have a lot of overseas students, and very often our overseas students know more about British natural history than our local students. First year biologists at Oxford on this residential field course. And before they went off to Orielton in South Wales for the field course, they were given this questionnaire to fill in. And this was done under exam conditions in a lecture theatre, where they were asked to write the names of 5 British birds, 5 British trees, 5 British butterflies, 5 British mammals, and 5 British wildflowers other than trees, and to give a name in the most specific form that they could. So don't say sparrow, say house sparrow, if you can. I'd have accepted folk names, but nobody ever gave me any. And then they were asked to put a tick in the box if they thought it was native or introduced, or they didn't know. So each name was scored out of 3 points, where 3 was specific, blue tick as opposed to, and I reserved the right to give 1 mark for ostrich if that kind of thing happened. And then they got another mark for whether they correctly knew whether it was native or not. So this is a free listing exercise. I'm not asking them to identify things. I'm asking them to come up with names off the top of their head. What do you know? So the total score possible is actually out of 100. And then the back of the form, this is totally anonymous. The back of the form asks them the most significant point. bit about their education background, whether they grew up in the town or the country, that's that kind of thing. But who did they learn their natural history knowledge from? And tick all that apply. So mum, dad, grandparents, uncles, aunts, friends, TV. David Attenborough cropped up quite a bit. And the results, I'm just going to summarize very briefly. So while 95% of students could give 5 bird names, only a bit over half could give them to species level. So seagull, duck. No, I want mallard, widgeon, teal, gaddle, whatever, okay? So the difference between some sort of broad folk generic, like duck or seagull, as opposed to species. So only 55.7% of students could give that to species level. Only 12.8% correctly named 5 British butterflies, and nearly half of them couldn't name a single British butterfly. And that is the extinction of experience. It is not their fault. They do not meet butterflies. It is not their fault. Now, something really important, I hope you can see this nicely about the birds. So what we have in each of these graphs is the total score and the total number of taxa that they named in the bottom set of graphs. The total score correlated against the scores for a particular taxonomic group, your birds, trees, butterflies, etc. And analysis of this showed that their knowledge of birds best predicted their total score. So basically, it was suggesting that if they had a knowledge of birds, they'd be pretty good all-round naturalists, or they were more likely to. And butterflies was their weakest. But the really striking thing, and what makes this folk knowledge, we actually discovered that students who said teachers were a source of knowledge did slightly worse than those who didn't. And those who said that teachers were a principal source of their knowledge did significantly worse than those who didn't. Why? Because it's not the teacher's fault. It's because this is basically folk knowledge. And this is knowledge that is held in families. Because what this is showing, the different shades on here, the gray and black points on the graphs are those who said they had parents and or grandparents. And if they had parents and grandparents teaching them stuff, they did really well. So the black dots are up on the top right of each of those graphs. So this is folk knowledge. Those families in which parents and grandparents contribute to the children's education in natural history, those are families with a culture of natural history, basically. Right? But those who don't have either, I would say, are kind of deprived, really. And they're not necessarily urban. But actually, in the urban context, it's more important. That's the big difference between the town and the country. In the urban context, it's more important that they have that family connection. Now we can score the actual names of the birds that they named, because only one person said Great Northern Diver and wrote a little essay in the margin. It was Great Northern Diver, Lesser Spotted Woodpecker, Little Egret, and wrote a mini essay in the margin. They only had 10 minutes for this, and it was anonymous. It didn't count to anything. I didn't know who this person was, but wrote an essay on the fact that little egrets had only arrived in the UK, the last 50 years because of climate change, blah, 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 blah. Oh, well, the only student to get 100 on the whole thing. But the point is that, okay, if you say robin, blackbird, whatever, those names kind of have less value than Great Northern Diver, Lesser Spotted Woodpecker, whatever. So the value score is related to the relative salience, the number of individuals who said a bird. So like 50 people say robin, okay, fine. Robin has less value then because more people know it. Whereas Great Northern Diver, because only one person said it, that's a high value score. Now, the interesting thing is that if we plot a student's mean bird name value against their total score for all taxa except birds. So we leave the birds out. So that makes them kind of independent data sets, in a sense, or independent knowledge. You can see a very strong positive correlation between the value of the birds named and their overall knowledge of natural history. What that is saying is that the opportunity to show that you know something about this, even if the person you're demonstrating it to doesn't know who you are, is important. That's a point. They could have said blue tit, great tit, cold tit, whatever. But they wanted to say something about their knowledge. And it wasn't just that student. So we published this in 2020 in the journal People of Nature, Knowledge of Nature and the Nature of Knowledge. And I just love the picture I took of Noah there, who gave me permission to use this and splash it on the internet. I just love the delight in his face in holding a robin for the first time, with the points that students thrive on field-based learning. Not just students, all young people, and that's my sermon tonight, really, is that. I just want to give a little plug to our research group at Oxford, some of our doctoral students there at the top. Rosa is here with us. Oh, sorry. Is with us, and I'm sure the others are watching online. And some of my colleagues who've worked with us on the Ethno-Ornithology World Atlas project, which, amongst other things, aims to map all of those wonderful Defay bird names, which was why I went to see him 10 years ago. You can log on to the website that is live. I won't do it, but I'd like to end. So I started off by talking about one hero. I want to end by dedicating this to another hero who sadly passed away just before Christmas. So Michel Defay, without whose extraordinary dedication over decades, we wouldn't know a fraction of these amazing names. Thank you very much.